Hi, you're listening to the Jan Spragge Show here on Northumberland 89.7. We're live streaming worldwide at our website, northumberland897.ca. It is an absolute pleasure to have Katy Hutchison on the phone today. Katy is a concerned parent, author, and restorative justice advocate with a compelling real-life story. A story that started New Year's Eve in 1997 when her husband, Bob McIntosh, was murdered while trying to break up a teenage house party. Following that night, Katy waited over 5 years while the police worked tirelessly to obtain the evidence to prosecute and convict his killers. During that period, Katy grew to recognize the need to advise and educate young members of the community about the risks that arise with the combination of young people, alcohol, and a lack of supervision. With this, Katy chose a path for herself that exemplifies the power of forgiveness and restorative justice, choosing to stand together with Bob's killer in order to educate others, and in the process, she set herself free. Katy joins us from her office in British Columbia. Welcome to the show, Katy. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Katy, for those who aren't aware of how your work in restorative practice began, could you please briefly tell us about the events in the late 1990s that catapulted you into a new space?
Absolutely. My husband Bob and I were living in a small community in British Columbia, Squamish, right between Vancouver and Whistler. And we had chosen that community because we wanted to raise our family in a small town. And Bob was running a busy law practice and competing all over the world at the age group ranked triathlete. And on New Year's Eve in 1997, we were celebrating with a small group of friends and were made aware that a house party was going on down the street at the home of a vacationing neighbor who was a close friend of ours. And while he was away, his teenage son had decided to host a New Year's party. And Bob became concerned when he wasn't able to reach the young man on the telephone, and so decided, along with two of his friends that were at our home that evening, to just check up to make sure that the young people in that house were okay before we curled up and cracked open a bottle of champagne to ring in the new year. And what they encountered was a house full of kids. There was 200 people there. It was clearly out of control, and the host was nowhere to be found. Bob went to secure the master bedroom to make sure there was no one in our friend's personal space, which unfortunately there were. And he was put on the ground by a punch from one young man, and then kicked in the head repeatedly by another, and died as a result of a massive cerebral hemorrhage from the kicks to the head. So I found myself in the early hours of the 1st of January 1998 struggling to explain to my children that something horrible had happened and that their daddy was dead. And I also realized that I had to choose very carefully how I began to walk this uncharted path for the sake of my kids, because they had clearly just lost their father, and I didn't want them to lose me in the aftermath, which was really what started my unconventional experience walking through grief and the justice system.
And like you say, the path you chose, there wasn't a guidebook for. Did you recognize what was going on as forgiveness, or how did you see it at the time?
What I recognized was that what I was feeling was not what I was feeling from the community and from the public. Because the story became public very quickly, I knew that I wasn't experiencing the feeling of hate and vengeance that people who weren't in my sort of inner circle were experiencing. And I think that was survival for me, because I looked at my children and was thinking very deeply about who I wanted to be for them as we set off on this journey of grief and healing. And it wasn't about judging other people by the way they were feeling. I think their reactions were out of fear, and I think as a society that is often how we react when frightening things happen. The person, interestingly, that I could envision tossing and turning in their bed in my community was the mother of the young man who had done this, even though at that point I had no idea who he was or who she was. It seemed to me that there was another family that was going to be as profoundly affected by the harm as my family, and that was the family of the person who was responsible for killing Bob.
So much is written about the word forgiveness, and in this moment, the word forgiveness seems too small to possibly touch on what was going on.
It does, and really, I don't think I used that word right away. I was very focused on myself, my children, how we were going to move forward. The sidebar was this constant awareness of this other family and the experience that they were likely having. Ryan Aldridge, the young man responsible for Bob's death, wasn't arrested for 5 years, and it was when I met him and saw him in the early hours after his arrest that the word forgiveness sort of came into my head, because what I saw was not some kind of monster, as perhaps I expected in my fearful moments before he came through the door, but a young man that could have been a neighbor, a nephew, a friend, and just the whole sad humanity of it all crashed down, and I think that's when the words made sense to me. Before that, it was more abstract, and it was more about what I needed to do to be whole, to move forward, all the while not diminishing the seriousness of what had happened and the profound loss of Bob.
How important was the way you were brought up? Forgiveness and restorative relationships weren't new to you, is my understanding, in 1997. In fact, your father had taught you this beautiful lesson early on, which you share in a TED Talk. So how important was those lessons you learned early on? Were they a part of that?
They were a part of it, but I really had to do a lot of reflection after the fact. What I did felt organic to who I was. It felt like what I had to do. It felt like the right thing. I didn't understand then why it felt that way. And perhaps that's often the way we do respond with the subtle ways we've been brought up and things that are so intrinsic to our family experience. It was only much later when people asked me, how did you come to that place? And I had to think, well, how did I come there? For some people it's from faith, and that wasn't my experience. I had been raised in a Christian home, but I really didn't embrace that the way that I embraced simply how we were as a family, how connected we were, how we were welcome to talk about difficult things, to work through difficult things, and how when the going got tough, it wasn't about pushing people away, it was about bringing people together, even if it was to sit in silence, but to share space through difficult times was just an expectation in my family.
Mm. For those of us who might be sitting back and thinking of someone who we might want to forgive but have had issues with, are there any thoughts?
Excuse me. First of all, I think the important piece for me was that the forgiveness, before it was for Ryan, the forgiveness was for me. It was my way of saying, I choose to not be defined by this horrific act of which I had no control. And again, it wasn't about letting anybody off the hook. It was not about saying, oh, it's okay. It wasn't okay. But I had an expectation that I deserved to have a rich and full life that was not going to be constantly pulled down and diminished by this act. And I also couldn't think of a better legacy for Bob than for Ryan to be let off that hook to do something positive and productive and powerful with his own life.
Yeah, and seeing a new choice for yourself, one that
Absolutely.
was freeing.
taking responsibility, accepting what he had done was as wrong could be, but not letting that be part of a spiral downwards. I didn't want any more devastation. I didn't want any more loss to my family, to his family, to our community. And I think, we're sorely misguided as a society if we expect pushing people away and just simply incarcerating them is going to turn them into more humane people. It just doesn't work that way. People get out of jail, they become our neighbors, and often they're in a worse off emotional state upon release than they are when they go in, and I didn't want to see that happen with Ryan. And for me, the forgiveness was my way of staying connected with him in the hopes that when he got out, he was going to have a life with purpose and a life that was safe.
And one of the ways you did this was through restorative justice. Could you tell us a little bit about that process?
Absolutely, and I want to preface it by saying that saying restorative justice and forgiveness in the same sentence is wrong. The restorative justice process was something I engaged in, and the forgiveness was something I personally experienced, but the two do not go hand in hand, and there should never be an expectation that forgiveness needs to have anything to do with engaging in a restorative process. So I just want to make that very, very clear that there's a big distinction between two very different things. My decision to meet with Ryan was because I felt that while the police and the courts were going to address the fact that a law was broken and that there needed to be a conversation about punishment, that did nothing to give me a voice. It did nothing to address how his crime impacted me, my family, my community. And the restorative justice meeting was an opportunity to have a say and to explain the impact of his actions and to talk about what we were going to do to try and make things marginally better, and also to gain some insight into who he was and what was going on in his world to put him in a place to be capable of doing what he did. But that was very separate from my own personal experience around forgiveness. There's many, many restorative experiences that take place where forgiveness is not even on the table.
That's interesting. I'm glad you made that distinction, because I know for myself that sometimes I look at that maybe in the wrong way for myself, because, like you say, the restorative relationship can be one where you are just having a say.
Absolutely. It does not. I mean, you think of many, many situations where a person would never agree to sit and have that difficult conversation if there was going to be an expectation that they were going to forgive.
Mm-hmm.
And then there may also be situations where people choose to forgive and never have an opportunity to have a restorative conversation. They're definitely mutually exclusive experiences.
Mm-hmm. So what's the major stumbling block, then, you think, with both of these things?
Well, I think the stumbling block with restorative opportunities is simply moving ourselves away from a punitive culture where we think that, for instance, in the experience of violent crime, that building bigger jails and filling them with increasingly large numbers of offenders for longer sentences is going to create a safer society. We only need to look slightly south to our good friends in the United States to realize that model just does not work. The prison complex, that whole machine, doesn't accomplish what I think people would like to think it accomplishes. And I've actually turned my attention more to the education system, because I think that's where hope lies, is educating a generation of young people who expect a restorative opportunity, so that when they go on to be parents and employees and caregivers of young people, that they will use a restorative way of handling conflict. So when we look at our schools and we think, for instance, in a situation where somebody is being bullied, that the person responsible for that behavior isn't simply expelled, because that's simple and that gets the problem out of the classroom or out of the schoolyard, but does it really address the harm? Does it really give the person affected or the people affected an opportunity to explain what that's feeling like? Or does it give the young person responsible for the behavior an opportunity to explore why they might be behaving in that way. So when we introduce restorative practices into the way we manage our classrooms and the way we handle discipline in our schools, in the way we learn, in the way we are as a family, in the way we behave in a staff room, for instance, because we all know that bullying doesn't stop in the schoolyard. It's something that affects us as adults as well. That's where I'd like to see us move as a society, and I think when we do, the benefits will be exponential in the way we live in community.
How is restorative practice brought into a school or a work group?
Well, for instance, a school may choose, quite often, a senior administrator or a teacher has been exposed to the model and brings it back to the school and talks about how can we make this a part of our culture. And it's not just a matter of the principal saying, when we have a discipline issue, we're going to manage it in a circle and offer an opportunity for people to have a say. It can be a complete culture shift where the whole school is involved. Teachers are trained. Parents are brought on board so they understand the way in which conflict is going to be managed. Kids are given an opportunity to participate in the architecture of their classrooms and how we are together, using a circle as a way of gathering to just talk about the good things as well as the difficult things, and then it becomes a structure that looks after itself. It's a beautiful way of taking classroom management out of the hands of the teacher, who really wants to be focusing on curriculum, and the kids begin to take responsibility for their own little community, and then the administration sees less referrals for discipline issues. So it's a whole culture shift, but there's many schools in many parts of the world where they've seen incredible results, and one only needs to sort of do a little bit of research to see that it is a very positive way of handling school culture or workplace culture.
Yes, and I understand, I think on your TED Talk you mentioned about a school where two parents had come in.
That's right. It was an experience I had in Baltimore, visiting a school in the inner city that was, plagued with some challenging issues around poverty and unemployment, and a lot of tension in the schools, a lot of violence in the streets around the school, and the minute you walked through the door, it just felt like a safe haven. The principal, the teachers, the connection between the administration, between the staff, between the students, everything was happening in circles. The kids felt included, they participated, they had a say, they felt a sense of control over their community. It was a beautiful thing. And the principal shared with me that it was having a ripple effect on the community, and that the parents of two very young students who lived in a housing project across from the school had sort of burst through the door of the general office one morning, yelling and screaming at each other and asking to see the principal. And she came out of her office to see what was going on, and these women were trying to deal with an issue that had nothing to do with the school, that was an issue in the housing complex, and demanded that the principal provide a circle like the kids were getting at school to help them work out their situation. So it was a beautiful example of how children teach us how to teach. And when we share with them a way of being, it will have a ripple effect. And I really believe the more we can do to instill restorative practices in our educational system, the more we will move towards a safer, more resilient population.
That's a great story. It's very nice. Today we have the pleasure of chatting with author Katy Hutchison. After the break, Katy will share more of her insights and wisdom from her life experience. I'm Jan Spragge. You're listening to Northumberland 89.7. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to the Jan Spragge Show. Just before the break, we were chatting with Katy Hutchison about the wisdom she has gained through her life and work. Katy, we were talking a little bit about restorative practices, and One of the things, concepts I really like that you bring into the conversation is time in. Can you share that with us?
When I was a new parent with toddler twins, many of my friends with their own children were using a timeout approach to discipline. So when something went wrong, they would, remove the child and put the child in a situation of isolation where they were, hopefully going to think about their indiscretion and somehow change their behavior. And I mean, quite honestly, it physically didn't work for me with two little ones to remove one from the situation, because then I had two to look after who were in two different physical spaces. And it seemed that it did nothing to really answer the questions about how the behavior was affecting the other child or the family in general. So I adopted what we refer to as the time-in technique, where we would sit together as a family and talk about the behavior that had just happened and give the kids an opportunity, even at a very young age, to talk about how they were feeling about what had just happened. And I think that's really the precursor philosophy around restorative practice, that we need to come together when harm happens in our communities, because it's a violation of relationship that's taken place. And so we need to address how that harm has affected the relationship if we're going to move forward. We talk about restorative questions. When something goes wrong, we ask, what happened? Like, just without judgment, what happened? And give people an opportunity to tell their story. And then who has been affected by what happened? And sometimes it's very obvious who's been affected, and sometimes we forget that people have been affected by the ripple effect. Peripheral people have been affected by what happened. And, what did that feel like to be affected by what took place? And this is all time in. This is all spending time having these conversations, creating a safe place to have a difficult chat about something that has affected a relationship. And then, what are we going to do to make things better? How do we move forward? How do we stop this from happening again or prevent it as best we can? And then we step away feeling as though we've participated. We've had a say. We haven't been at the effect of a, quote, system. We have played a role in moving forward and making things a little bit better or a lot better.
One of the things that you brought out is that bullying and anti-bullying is portrayed in today's media as exactly sort of the opposite approach, the ways things are dealt with.
They are, and I wish we could actually find a different word. To me, the word bully, for one thing, it's a label. It talks about a person rather than a behavior. And I think it conjures up all kinds of very cliche images. And what I really prefer to talk about is when people treat other people poorly, without respect, or say harmful things or do harmful things. You have to tease out what is the behavior that is attracting the label, sort of the catch-all phrase. And we do need to bring people together. Now, there's certainly conditions that must be met before you bring people together, and it's not something that should be just tried without any kind of training or understanding how to safely facilitate. Both parties have to want to be there, and the offending party has to be willing to accept responsibility for their actions. So you don't start popping two people in a room when they're not comfortable about being in the same space. So it requires some preparation, and that's why the training piece is crucial. But when that is in place, and when people do want to come to the table, and when extended groups of the community, maybe family members or in a school setting, other people in the school who have been affected by the relational issues, have an opportunity to come together, they form the support system that carries through once the circle has disbanded. It's a beautiful thing. It kind of becomes a self-monitoring proposition.
Self-monitoring, yeah. That's very nice. In the foreword of your book, Frederick Luskin, author of Forgive for Good, there's a quote, "My unkindness is not that different than your unkindness."
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about that and your experience with that?
Well, I think as a society, we also tend to put a giant chasm between ourselves and the people that cause harm. That could never be me. I would never treat somebody that way. We as a species are all capable of saying hurtful things, of behaving in a hurtful way towards, other people in our community. And I think we need to accept that. We need to not place ourselves on some kind of different level than the people that cause harm, realizing that there may have been instances in our own lives where we have said something hurtful or behaved in a hurtful manner towards others. And when we embrace that as part of our humanity, I heard a quote recently, and I must look it up to figure out who to attribute it to, but that the line between good and evil does not run between people. It runs within each of our own hearts. And I think that speaks to the same idea that we need to accept responsibility as a humanity, that we are capable of doing unspeakable things, and do everything we can to look for accountability and to help one another through that, which isn't about diminishing it. It's about putting it on the table, talking about it, and figuring out how we move forward in a positive, healthy, and safe way.
You say also that for you, with your twins, who your kids are going to be is what's important to you, not what they will do.
Yes, exactly. I talk about wanting to raise human beings, not human doings. What my children ultimately decide to do in their life in order to put food on the table is important, but it's not as important to me as who they are while they are doing what it is they do. I like to think that my children are going to be good friends, good partners, good parents, kind, empathetic, compassionate, connected members of their communities. That is much more important to me than what they actually do for a living. And that speaks, I think, to the importance of social-emotional learning in our schools.
Mm-hmm. That's really going to help. One of the first things that you really got going with at the beginning, which was the story of Bob, and sharing that with Ryan by your side. I feel I'd be remiss to not touch on the drugs and alcohol issues and what's important to you in that.
Oh, choice. Absolutely choice. Getting kids to think through their decision-making. We know so much more now about brain science and about the facts of the brain development piece, the prefrontal cortex, and how young people's brains don't stop growing until they're 25. There's so much going on, for instance, in the frontal lobe region of an adolescent, and how crucial it is to avoid that early exposure to alcohol and other drugs at that age, because we're simply not wired at that stage for good decision making. We have a high risk or a high appetite for risk and a low ability to assess the implications of behavior at that stage. And explaining that to kids in a way where they can understand some of the science behind why we are encouraging them to minimize their experimentation and use of substances, particularly at that stage. It's not just about saying no because I'm the parent. It's giving them some information to understand how dangerous it can be, and also how the likelihood of addiction is greater when there's an earlier exposure to substances. And then also the whole idea about group mentality and how large numbers of kids gathered together with that layer of alcohol and other drugs can simply be a recipe for disaster. The risk-taking behavior often increases when there is large numbers of people around, and now we have the added layer of social media and the fact that much of the behavior is going to be captured on film and preserved on the internet. is just another worrisome layer for us as parents or educators to wade through as we help kids learn to make good social decisions for themselves.
And I would think, as a parent, to learn some of these models of restorative practice would be helpful. Are there ways for people, parents, individuals to learn as well as groups?
Oh, absolutely. And to me, the whole restorative model, the idea of peace building, using a circle, is really an extension of family dinner. It's what we do when we're in a functional, connected family. The way we share, the way we give each other an opportunity to speak, the way we learn to listen. So when the training that I'm doing with Shannon Moroney, who's a wonderful peace builder and colleague of mine from Ontario, when we work with schools, we include parents in that experience so that they learn some of the techniques that we're sharing with teachers and with kids, so that when they're dealing with, a sibling issue at home or an extended family conflict, that they have some of the tools, very simple tools, for setting up a safe space to have a difficult conversation.
Many years now have passed since Bob's death, Katy, and during that time you've certainly dug deep in a number of different ways. From where you sit today, what wisdom would you want to convey to that younger version of yourself who stood in that emergency room on New Year's Eve in 1997?
I would love to go back and just remind myself that listening to your gut and your heart is so important. It was very, very hard for me at that stage with two small children and a community who was leaning in one direction while I leaned in what felt like an almost solitary direction away from them, because I believed so strongly that this is the way I wanted this to unfold, to get some sense of control over a situation that I really, to that point, had no control over. I would just like to remind myself that I did make good decisions, and, if this had happened now, I would hope there would be much more in place in community to support a restorative opportunity at all points. I think of how differently things may have turned out for Ryan had he had an opportunity when he was in school to be engaged in a restorative conversation when he was trying to manage some conflict that, was impacting him and the decisions he was making. Things could have looked so differently if some of those restorative pieces had been in place in my community.
Beautifully said. What's next for Katy Hutchison?
I am enjoying an empty nest with kids off at university. I would love to start doing some more writing to reflect back and revisit some of the amazing places I've visited. I've traveled to many parts of the world since beginning to share my story so many years ago, and met incredible young people who've inspired me in some of the most difficult situations. I continue to volunteer for a great group called Love Leave Out Violence, who run a summer camp every year in Ontario for kids who have been either witnesses, victims, or perpetrators of violence. And these young kids are coming together and developing incredible leadership skills to take back to their own communities to help build safety and just true peace builders. So continuing that work and trying to involve myself a little more in my local community in Victoria, because I've spent so much time on the road. It's lovely now to be a little more connected locally and to see what I can do in my own backyard.
Might you share some of those writings with the world?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to write again.
Great. That's nice. That's really nice. I'll look forward to that.
And also to continue my collaboration with Shannon Moroney, because she and I have found a real kinship around creative ways of talking about peace building.
Interesting. That's great. How can we find out more about your work, Katy?
I have a website, Katy Hutchison Presents. Certainly if you Google me, there'll be lots to look at. The TEDx talk is available online. The Canadian version of my book is basically sold out, but I think most book suppliers can order the American edition, which is actually no different other than the cover and the endorsements on the cover. So yeah, there's definitely lots to read, and I encourage people to look at what grassroots restorative justice or practice initiatives are taking place in their own communities, and to find out how they can get involved. If they're connected to a school, through the Parents Auxiliary, seeing what resources are available locally to start having restorative conversations in schools that their young people might be attending.
That's great, yeah. And even the old-fashioned sit around the dinner table and chat.
Absolutely. I cannot say enough about how important family dinner is.
That's nice. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I hope we can have you back again. Please keep us up to date on what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for taking the time. It really has been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure for me to enjoy a safe summer.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. Joining us in the studio today has been author and speaker Katy Hutchison. You can find out more about Katy's work by visiting her website, katyhutchisonpresents.com. There you'll find more information about Katy, her book, which is a wonderful read, I have to say, Walking After Midnight, One Woman's Journey Through Murder, Justice, and Forgiveness, as well as links to websites about the important issues we've discussed today during the interview. Katy's book, Walking After Midnight, is available also in ebook form at your favorite bookseller. And there's a Lifetime movie that's been made about Katy's life and her experience, Bond of Silence.